No, yes, it works now. Thank you for coming this on this evening or afternoon. We have a difference when we say afternoon up to when the sky is black, and then it's night, not evening. Anyway, thank you for coming here, and it has been a special wish, special interest for me to come to San Antonio. Since a long time, I had been visiting the U.S. many times, but I was never able to come here. And I was now very lucky to be able to get to see some classics, world classics like the River Walk, and discover a place I never heard about before, but it's charming, which is King William's neighborhood, which is fantastic. So you have a lot of treasures, and I wish you the good luck in preserving them and enhancing them, and in extending that charm to the rest of the city, which is not that fortunate, I should say. I'm sorry, don't want to be rude, but what I wanted to share with you is some ideas about how the centers, about the centrality in Havana. There's a common wisdom that says that Havana is a polycentric city, a monocentric city, and this is wrong. From the very beginning, it was a polycentric city to begin with because it grew in a conurbation process, incorporating surrounding settlements. And each of these settlements already had a center. So it worked as a collection, as a system of centers. But even more is that the old World Prison, which is probably you know designated by UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1982, this World Prison of 143 hectares has not one major or main square, but the system of squares, each with its own personality, without being able to say this is the main, this is the principal, but just a system of squares. And this fact also helped in defining a strategy for the recovery of Old Havana, which is one of the, I should say, few successful programs going on in Cuba of recovery of the built fabric. And this is because they focused around the main on the squares and around the main squares and along the connecting axis of those squares, and finally begin to extend to the rest of the fabric. The thing is, I remember when Old Havana was proposed to UNESCO as a World Heritage Site, and Amadou Matar Mbow visited Havana, and when he was taken around, he said, why only Old Havana? There are other areas in Havana that are worth of being designated. But maybe the government was a little afraid of, because extended designation brings together commitment to do something with that. And anyway, what I'm planning to show to you is how the center of Havana, the original Havana, grew and moving to the west all the time, and changing its character and creating a new centrality, but without eliminating the former. So it's like a string of centers in a way. This centrality has been very much damaged by the lack of resources, especially in the last 30, 40 years. And the old commercial, the traditional commercial center has been very much damaged. And I will show you also, especially after what I think it was a wrong policy, to develop a new suburban center, repeating the same mistakes as so many countries did. And this center is sucking life, or at least sucking investment money from putting that money into the old traditional center, which was very much used by everybody. And this suburban center is depending on cars. Well, you know, these kind of things. And this is one thing I think better go on with the slides, and so talk to you about that. The city of Havana was founded over there in 1519 because of the bay. As you can see, the bay has a very narrow neck. All this eastern part is a hill, and very good ships inside the bay were protected from pirates and from hurricanes, both. And the city, because the bay was an obstacle, because this hill was difficult to settle, and also because all this was military, the city grew to the west. So there were walls coming like this on both sides, the land side and the water side. This is the UNESCO site, together with an extension from the 19th century beyond the walls, when the walls were torn down, and together with the whole defensive, colonial defensive system, which is impressive. So much, so large that you cannot understand the reason. And the fact is that it was not only meant to protect the city, but to protect the ships and the wealth inside the ships, because Havana was the last stop of all the Spanish ships before sailing back to Europe, filled with all the gold and silver from America. And initially, and for almost 2 centuries, Havana was a city of sailors and soldiers. And all those fortresses were made with money brought from Mexico, because Spaniards found very quickly that Cuba was lacking enough gold, and then they went to the continent. It was, by the way, used as a springboard to conquer the continent. And later on, for some years, already in the 20th century, was also used by the USA as a springboard to Latin America. This is the main river of Havana. The main river of Havana, the Almendares River, that goes like this. It's not much of a river, and it has a lot of problems, especially pollution, even if lately the pollution has improved. I mean, the water condition has improved, not the pollution. And it has beautiful green spaces over here, but it's not properly used. The river divides the city. Actually, Havana was one city, and this western side to the west of the river was another city. I'm talking even up to early 1950s. And the whole idea is using the river instead of separate to connect. And this needs to, maybe what you did here with the river walk is a fantastic idea. Maybe Bill's students can work something on this and bring the experience of San Antonio with the river. The whole city, originally founded in 1519, followed the typical Spanish-American grid that was later officially registered in the laws of Indies from 1573. And so the same grid you can find in the world present was extended to the west in central Havana, and then with some changes also to this southern part that was populated by Cuba's aristocracy in the 1830s, 1840s, up to late 1800s. And then a very interesting neighborhood appeared in 1859, growing opposite to the general direction of growth of the city, Vedado, it's called Vedado, from west to east, until it met around this area with the older city. And well, there were, as I said before, many different villages around that became part of a metropolitan area, but still managed to keep their personality. Let me keep on going. So there was, just to use this image, an old historic center over here with the 5 main principal squares. Again, no main square. And then some transverse streets running east-west and performing as linear centers, but by pairs, because the blocks were so small that the streets were very close. And so there's one pair of streets, more or less on the upper third, Obispo and O'Reilly, and then there's another pair of streets in the lower third. And those, usually people, it's interesting, they walked along one street and then returned along the other. This was typical of this. And the shops in here, the stores and shops, were very European. Small shops facing the street. And then when it reached this point, there's an interesting building. I'll show you. And then all this area was developed already in the 19th century, especially after 1940s, with large department stores. So it was a shift from looking into Europe into looking into United States, big department stores. Then you had the historic center, you had the commercial center, and then in this area where Vedado met Centro Havana, a modern center with a large concentration of modern architecture from the 50s, developed a very cosmopolitan center, still alive, even if it has lost part of its life. Again, here in red, you can see these centers I was talking about, the old historic center, the commercial center with some extensions. This is a linear center along Calzada del Cerro, another one going south, and this is another one connecting with the old center of Marianao, and this is La Rampa, a place very alive, called La Rampa because the street has a slope going into almost into the ocean. Very beautiful. You see the water back down there, and I remember a journalist who said once, "La Rampa is not a place; it's a state of mind," and I think he was right. Well, again, these the centers I mentioned before, small towns that were assimilated, conurbated, but this is Kohima, where Hemingway kept his fishing boat, and his skipper lived until he died at 102 years, the man who served as a model for The Old Man of the Sea. And keep on. This is the Plaza de Armas, the Square of Arms, which is the place where the older fortress made by Europeans in stone in America is. It's not shown here, over there. It's a fort that was built from 1558 to 1577, and when they finished it, they realized it was useless because it was so deep into the city fabric that if the enemy reached that point, the only thing they could do was lock themselves and wait. But it's, of course, initially it didn't have trees because it was for the military, and militaries don't like trees. And then they, later on, these were planted, and this is a fantastic building, the Palace of the Spanish Governors. By the way, I don't know if you know this, there was a time when the governor, Spanish governor in Havana, governor of Cuba, was also governor of Louisiana, Count Alejandro O'Reilly, and he was nicknamed in New Orleans Bloody O'Reilly because it seems he was a very tough man. And so the links with Havana and some southern Mobile, New Orleans, Baton Rouge, Pensacola were quite strong. This is the it's interesting that the central courts are like interior plazas, especially, of course, courts as big as this one, which is very beautiful with double height arcades, beautiful, and the pattern that was typical on those squares was that the main buildings could come into the space of the square as long as they left open a double height gallery for pedestrians. And it created a very nice pattern because you came along the street and the street continued under the building. This is another dry square, Plaza Vieja. This fence was luckily removed after this photo. And this was the last building already finished, restored, and the whole plaza is fully restored. This is an unusual plaza because there was no presence of military or religious or civil power, just money power, wealthy families that lived around. Another interesting square in the same area, in the same wall present, is Plaza de San Francisco, called San Francisco because of this church and convent. In 2002, a Congress of the UTSA was held in this building because it has a lot of big rooms. And even if the plaza is named San Francisco because of the convent and church, that no longer exists because the church sold it a long time ago. The main activity here was, because it was so close to the port, was trade related with the port. And this building from 1909 is one of the first office buildings in Cuba with a dome, you can see behind, and a statue of Mercury, the god Mercury, not Fred. And it's, by the way, it was damaged during a hurricane. They had to bring it down and fix it again. And the square is also interesting because it's not a regular square. It has some, the main piazza, and then like a piazzetta over here. And it has also it's not surrounded by porticos, which is what happens in the rest of the squares. The Cathedral Square, which has fantastic proportions and has the main actress here is the cathedral, the best Cuban Baroque building. And all these other buildings surrounding the space belong to Cuban noble families, the Count of Casabayona, the Marquis of Aguas Claras, the Count of Lombillo, several Peñalver, Counts of Peñalver, and it's very much used, and it has very fine proportions. And again, some of these buildings, for instance, this building, Peñalver and the Marquis of Arcos, which is a little farther there, originally faced the other street because this, originally the plaza, the square was not a square, was a swamp. When they dried up the swamp and paved it, it became a very nice space, and then these families built new facades facing the new plaza. The Malecón is one of the icons, probably the most characteristic icon of Havana, all the waterfront. It's a 7-kilometer long waterfront promenade with a low-rise seawall that actually performs as a giant bench. Well, here there are so many people trying to sit in this day, probably a very hot day, that you don't see the wall. Then there's a problem because this was built at a time when the civil engineers, I'm sorry if there are civil engineers here, but civil engineers convinced everybody that man could tame nature. And now what happened is that nature is claiming back its toll, and there are floodings. The sea, or you see here a very nice, quiet sea, but it can become very, very rough. And then there are floodings, but even more than floodings, the problem is, that, especially in this sector of the Malecon, the constant aggression of the salt spray. And this is a real problem because the only thing that resists the corrosion is the local stone, but there are very few buildings made on that stone. Most were brick and stucco and painted, and all this is being repaired. All this strip, that 14 blocks, the first strip of the Malecon, are being repaired by the city historian office and poses a problem. They're putting back life here, like restaurants and cafeterias, but the thing is that people who lived on those buildings in the older part of the Malecon were not the original people, who were lower middle class, and the buildings were well kept. But people who live there now are poor, sometimes very poor. In a market economy, they couldn't afford living there because of, well, the value of living in the front line, even submitted to threats of coming from the sea. So what would be good for the buildings would be socially wrong, politically incorrect, would be a gentrification of all this strip with people who would be able to pay for themselves and repair the buildings, so the city could forget about dealing with those buildings. When you get closer, farther from the original part of the Malecon, more modern buildings begin to appear. In Vedado, this is the Havana Hilton Hotel, renamed Havana Libre. This is also a new building. And this is what happened in Vedado in the 1950s, when a law permitting condominiums was passed. And I always say that maybe in 10, 12, 15 years, the whole waterfront would have been a continuous wall of tall buildings closing the views into the ocean and crossing the breeze that cleans and soothes the temperature in the summer. There used to be very elementary swimming pools carved in this rock. And something interesting, in 2002 I was teaching at Harvard, and we were working with Malecon, and several students proposed an extension, creating large pools over here, so the waves would break farther from this front facade. And one even included a proposition to starting here, build a second tunnel under the bay, and this tunnel would also push back the breaking of the waves. This is Central Park. Also, is this area a pivot between Old Havana, that was on that direction. So this is Obispo Street, and comes from Old Havana, and then it reaches this green spot, one of the few green spots in Old and Central Havana, which is also the meeting point of this very beautiful street, Paseo del Prado, which is a promenade that was, very old, from 1700s, but then that was refurbished and given its present look in 1928 by the French landscape architect Jean-Claude Nicolas Forestier. So it's interesting, this connection of a green axis, a canopy, where pedestrians walk at a higher level than the cars on both sides, but also under a canopy of green canopy of trees. And there are monumental buildings all around this palace that was built in 1927 by the Spanish Association for Asturians, people born in Asturias, or some others. And this building, huge building that was called Manzana de Gomez. Manzana is a block. And this is a building following this trend in Europe that you can find in Milano, the Vittorio Emanuele galleries, or Pacifico in Buenos Aires, GUM in Moscow, with two diagonals. The building covers one full block, and it's all commercial and offices above. But this gave rise to an area over here, later on, the one I was mentioning earlier, since the 1940s, with big department stores. This one. Forget about the horrible colors. This is part of something that's happening. Havana was never a Caribbean city, but it's becoming one, accelerated because of the loud colors, loud music as well, and a lot of immigration coming from Eastern Havana, internal immigration coming from Eastern Cuba. And this used to be, there were very fine stores around here, but they are very depressed. They're lacking things to sell. And so it's a rundown district, but this could have benefited a lot if the money put in the new suburban center would have been put into this area. More of these buildings. This is a very fine, almost minimalist building by a leading Cuban architect in the 50s, one of the best stores. This is kind of paint jobs that are doing very edible. It's like strawberry and vanilla ice cream or something like that. And this is like avocado, green. And for some reason, this seems to fascinate people. This is Obispo Street in the late 1800s. There was such a narrow street with front stores facing the street, and it had awnings like in Seville to protect from the sun. And then this is the present view of Obispo. These are the typical colonnades that extended along the axis of expansion of the city, like fingers of a hand. And there were, these axes were named calzadas, like the French chaussée. And they had these porticated galleries, double height for pedestrians, like this. And it extended. So in the early 20th century, you could walk from the very origin of the city up to the outskirts of the city, not the periphery, and protected from the sun and the rain under these galleries. And this is something that has been happening together with the big stores. There was an enormous amount, thousands of small convenience stores, corner stores, like this. This is the main street of Havana, close to the university. But then the Cuban government could not afford to supply goods to all those thousands of small stores. And they decided to close a lot of them. And then, since there were so many people needing dwellings, needing a house, they gave away this to people who were very needed. People who were very needed, of course, didn't have any money. And so they did horrible things in very important points, which are the corners of a grid. The corners are the most important part of a grid. And this is, sometimes they didn't have money enough to put windows. This is a very elementary jealousy. So living here, it's lacking privacy, it's lacking ventilation, it's lacking light, and it's not a nice way to live, and also ruining the corners of the central city. This is the grid of Centro Havana, and it's a very regular grid. Central Havana has the highest density in Cuba. Many people think that the housing condition is worse in Old Havana, maybe because the word old brings an association of things that are decaying. But the fact is that the worst housing conditions in Havana are in Central Havana, because they use the same grid, but the lots were smaller, and there was already speculation. Ventilation is very poor. Actually, the temperature in this area is 1.2 centigrade degrees higher than the average of the city. It's an island of heat, and there's practically no green, very little green. But on the other hand, there is an opportunity. We proposed that and never received an answer. Most of these streets running north-south are, well, they had, in the corners, they had convenience stores that should be reopened. But also, trees could be planted because there's very little traffic north-south. Most of the traffic is east-west. And there's a possibility of planting trees in the streets and sharing the streets between cars, between pedestrians, kids, and why not, dogs also. And the thing is that, and that would be a possibility of putting hundreds of trees in this area. It's a pity, but it's not being done. Vedado is a place that was born with an aura of elegance. And of course, this is true because they have mansions, great, fantastic mansions like this or this. This is smaller but very nice. Or this, which is the house of the main character of a novel that I wrote, just appeared in Spain last month. And this is Vedado, an early plan of Vedado. First time when the streets were lined by trees. From time to time, the streets were wider and lined by trees, but from time to time, there were larger, wider streets with a central green median, and like Commonwealth Avenue, for instance, in Boston. And from time to time, also vacant blocks planted with trees, benches, and all that stuff. Vedado, as I said, always had this aura of elegance. Well, this typical with the marble lions, which was a sign of nobility. Later on, anybody having the money could buy the lions. And but Vedado was actually quite mixed, almost from the very beginning, socially mixed, I mean. The important thing that made the difference is that the upper class set the rules, dictated the patterns of behavior, dictated the look projected into the street. Not only you can find racism, you can find classism in this, but also it's a very simple argument to preserve the values of the properties. Because if the streetscape would be harmed by aggressions, the value would go down. And this is what's happening in Vedado, which is the place where I was born and where I live. It's, I think I'll have a couple of images which are very frustrating. All these buildings were set back with a front garden and a front porch like this. And now many porches are being closed and many gardens have been paved and built upon. And fences which were supposed to be always low-rise fences so you could see through, are being raised. And Vedado had a combination, very unusual, of centrality and at the same time green. It was very well served but in a quite disseminated way by theaters, restaurants, or galleries, whatever. And at the same time, it had some green. And I think also the more interesting thing is that houses were quite close to each other, but then from time to time, use all the space saved from putting the houses close. You could open one full block dedicated to a green space. I feel that Vedado still can teach us a lot of lessons to Cuban architects and planners. La Rampa, this area that is what I remember I mentioned that where Havana meets, Central Havana meets Vedado. This is the street seen from the sea is right here. And looking up, it has this slope. And this is the beginning. This is the roof of the Havana Libre Hotel. And this is a green space with a large cafeteria, which is the largest ice cream parlor probably in the world, I think. It's like a cathedral dedicated, actually has some of Brazilia's cathedral, some influence. And typically it started with 52 different flavors of ice cream, very fine ice cream. Right now I think they have 2, they offer 2. And this is what happened in Vedado with high-rises that began to be built in the 50s. This is an interesting building that it's an exhibition pavilion that embraces an existing building, and this was built in 1963 for the 7th Congress of the International Union of Architects in Havana. The building by McKinney and White, the National Hotel, in a very fine location over a rocky cliff opening into the sea, looking into the sea, and very close to La Rampa. La Rampa is right here. And this was the first modern building, public building in Cuba, built from 1945 to 1947. It was a complex of offices, radio stations, and TV, and this movie theater, which was originally named Warner. This building gave the first push for the development of La Rampa, and this happened in less than 12 years. It was incredible how fast La Rampa was developed. And I always said that in La Rampa they violated the regulations of Vedado. They didn't leave parterre. The parterres were paved. Of course, they left holes for trees. They paved the front gardens, and they also, there were no porches. There were mostly overhangs or something. And even with this violation, the results were not bad. I don't know if I should say this to many because this can bring problems. Somebody said, well, then if this worked, these violations worked in this case, why not my violations? I can do whatever I want to do. But the fact is that because it gave the area a more urban, more central aspect without the front porch and the front garden, which was typical for single-family houses. So this is a consented rape, I always say. This is the pavilion I mentioned before, embracing this existing building. This is the slope of La Rampa, and this is a very Miesian minimalist building, very fine with this very thin, in the form of crosses, tall columns, very slender, going straight into the roof. This hill is the place where Havana University was transferred. The university had been founded in Old Havana by a religious university in 1728. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, it was relocated in this hill, which is a hub between Vedado and Central Havana. Very interesting place. This is the campus, the rectorate building with this set of 4 columns, 4 sets of 4 columns, so you can see the sky beyond, and these giant steps that remind the Columbia Universities in New York City, but they are steeper and not that wide, and even more, they are framed by a secondary set of stairs on both sides with a different rhythm. I think this is an improvement. And as it happens with all hills, it provides a very interesting view from up to down and from down to up. It's very stimulating. Students' demonstrations came running the steps protesting against the dictatorship of Batista, and 3 blocks after, they were met by the police, and there were very, very big clashes. Originally fistfights, later on shootings. I have a friend who was shot over there, but luckily, well, I'm sorry, I won't say his name. He always said, I was shot in the leg, but he was shot in the buttock. Being a 45 caliber, it's not fun just to have this big hole pierced in the buttock. Well, actually, I said I was not going to say his name, but it's here, one of them. Well, it's not me to begin with. This is the first large monument made after the triumph of the revolution, and the first abstract. And we were a group of 4 friends. We have been studying together in the same year at architecture. The 4 of us were architects, very young, 30 years at that time. And the university is up there 3 blocks away in a hill. So this is exactly the corner where the police tried to stop the demonstrations. And this is meant, the monument was meant to pay respect to the people, students who had died through all the history of Cuba, fighting for freedom since the colonial days. And we broke away with several conventions. Instead of placing the monument in the middle of a square, we created the square with a monument. And this is a talking wall, concrete wall, that changes its shape and in different periods of the history of the fight. And for instance, over there tells about the 8 medical students shot by the Spaniards in 1871. And well, over there you can see, well, this is the beginning of revolts, students' revolts in the 1920s to create the autonomy of the university. And well, there are several, and this is the triumph of the revolution, that we wanted to be a finish but not an end, because the fighting never ends. And we try to play everything positive. The fight was vertical, the wall, and everything negative, the repression, were like horizontal slabs interrupting the fight. And this is how in this last monument, this horizontal slab is broken, and grass grows from the cracks as a sign of life. The funny thing, the maintenance of this area is horrible. By the way, there's all those benches that were stucco, originally pink, but the natural color of the stucco, were recently painted in striking yellow, this kind of yellow, without consultation. And this, all the greens areas of this area are very badly kept. But there's someone who is very carefully cutting all the grass that grows from the cracks. So it happens. It happens. A monument I hate to Jose Marti, the national hero, maybe because Batista did it in the 50s. And it was a complex of buildings, was supposed to be the new plaza, Civic Plaza, renamed after the revolution as Plaza de la Revolución. This building was going to be for the mayor of the city, and finally this was taken by the Ministry of Armed Forces. And I remember we were students at the time of this proposition, and one student found out that this was almost an exact copy of a monument, a commercial monument to the Shenley whiskey at the 1939 New York Fair. And they were using that for the Cuban national hero. Well, anyway, you could expect everything. This is a view of the model. This is the former Palace of Justice, very fascist building like this, very much influenced by buildings in Leo in Rome, Mussolini's. And this is the square, which is actually shapeless. It only looks okay when there are 800,000 people covering the space. This is a theater, and there's a sports hall back here. The rest are ministries. So it's a void space, no life. No people live there, no people walk there. My wife, Marta, once saw, I think at 6 or 7 p.m., a naked man walking over here, totally naked and smoking a cigarette, which made things more confusing, more mysterious, because where did he carry the matches and the... But the thing is that this is a demonstration that the place was dead. Somebody could do that and nothing happened. Anyway, this is CERT, actually, one of the good things of the CERT plan for Havana in 55, 58 was he organized this space as a series of like 3 articulated smaller plazas. And this is what happened after Che Guevara died. This building that had a blank wall, and by the way, it's the best modern building in this area, pictured a billboard in paper with the face of Che Guevara. And being paper, they were forced to replace the billboard very often. And I like the idea because, first of all, paper is cheap, and Che was an austere person. I think it matched with his personality. And also, there was always Che, but there was always a different Che designed by a different designer. And being a billboard, it was not supposed to be a work of art. It was design. So you didn't demand a very high quality as art. And then thinking they were doing the right thing, they substituted this face in paper by a permanent design on iron, which is ugly, and done by a very bad, not an artist actually, I think he works in stages for theater or something. But this is not the worst. The worst is that then recently, in this building, they didn't have a blank wall, and they invented the blank wall from the ground up, tied to the existing building, blocking the sun and the light into the existing building, and with another Cuban hero, so you would have both. And this new one is even worse than the other. So it's a good example of persistence in doing something wrong. Oh, this is the original Che Guevara. It creates a confusion because of the shadows. And this is the original building of which is now the Palace of the Revolution. I once proposed to produce pots, giant pots, into this gigantic colonnade so that it will break, perform almost as brise-soleil, and it will break the monumentality of this fascist building. More monuments of this period, the 1940s, first period of Batista, with this inspiration of in Rome, in Leo in Rome. And these are some propositions that were never carried out for Eastern Havana. This is part of what the creation of a new center that was called by the CERT plan on Eastern Havana. The fact is that this is the Morro Castle over here. This is the huge fortress of La Cabaña, which sits in top of Casablanca. And over there, they would build the presidential palace and some other facilities, just to make Batista feel safe, because 1 year before, his palace had been raided by a group of revolutionaries. Remember the monument we did by my 3 friends and myself? The four of us were members of an underground organization started at the University of Havana. And this organization in 1957 attacked the presidential palace. And they were this close of getting Batista, but didn't work. And so this was a way to put Batista away from the city and make him feel more safe. Central Park is over there, over here. And this is a very, very special place with all those buildings, hotels, whatever. This is the Sevilla Hotel by Schultz and Weaver. And this block, there's a full block originally with this kind of architecture. Only most was demolished, only this remained. And in that moment, I was the head of the planning department. I put a regulation saying that any new building should have to incorporate the remains, but not only to save the substance of the remains, but to give a kind of a push to the architect to reinvent this kind of architecture. But instead of that, they tried to copy, and they did these very silly arches. And the whole building looks like cardboard, not like a building, and in a great location. So we always said this is a typical building that should have been project that should have been placed in a contest. All Cuba should take part in that contest, and instead of ending with this very poor building. And this is a fashion I hate, which is mirror glass. This is a great building by Max Borges, one of the leading architects from the 50s, a very low-key building facing north. All this was glass, transparent glass, and the whole roof came from columns that opened like mushrooms and became the roof. Borges worked with Felix Candela a lot. And some years ago, the people from the bank decided to substitute the transparent glass that allowed to see these beautiful mushroom structures opening up for mirror glass. So now you walk along here and you see your face here. I don't need to see my face and I cannot see the inside. This is a commercial center facing west. The load of the over the air condition is horrible. And this is, also a hotel receiving all the sun from the morning this way and all the sun in the afternoon the other way. And worse than that, it has only small windows, big enough to stick your head out and get a smell of the sea, which is right here. So this is a hotel right by the sea, and you can even smell the sea. And this is a university that was finally dedicated to preservation, but I think it's a bad example because in that place, the original university was founded in 1728. The building was razed totally, and in its place was built a modern building. This is in old Havana, a modern building, very ugly. Everybody hated the building, but it was very well built. Finally, after considering whether to demolish the building or not, they decided to remodel the whole building, and they reinvented the bell tower. Nobody alive had ever seen that bell tower. So, and then again, the use of reflecting glass, with the excuse that it would reflect the beautiful facade, well, not the most beautiful, actually, the worst of the palace of the governors on that facade. And of course, I have talked to people who work over here, and they say that at some point at 3 o'clock they have to leave the rooms because the heat is terrible. More of this, we are becoming modern. We have already supermarkets, well, this is what happens. And this is the center, Miramar Trade Center. This is a model. It's to the west of Havana, depending on cars. There are 7 hotels. This is 1, 2, 3, 4. All these were designed by Cubans, and these 2. and then but operated as joint ventures with foreign partners. And this is the main street of this part of the city, one of the most beautiful streets in Havana, Fifth Avenue. And this is a series of 18 office and retail buildings, also a foreign venture, a joint venture, but with foreign capital. So all the money put in here to create a new center in a barren area, an area that at 7 p.m. is dead, totally dead. That money could have been put into the very center of Havana, and it would have been much. But the thing is that they were copying the typical suburban center, depending on cars, catering to hard. Well, I don't know if you know that we have two currencies in Cuba. One currency, which is the normal Cuban peso, in which we are paid, and we can pay some things like electricity or a few things. And then another currency, which is 25 times more valuable, that is for the rest. So people coming here have to pay when they go to shop around here, or if they go to a hotel, they have to pay in this hard currency. This is one of the buildings. It's a Jewish. The whole complex is with the money comes from Jewish private investors, and this is the architect, which is a Canadian Jew, of these buildings. This is another hotel, and this one, both, all the three of them, are Cubans. And this is what happens in the old center of Havana, the old commercial center. You have this very cheap makeshift way of selling things, very poor artisanry, whatever, or sometimes, and it makes me shiver with fear, all this is pork meat laying there in the open without refrigeration, and of course flies. And this is a very poor dwelling, and these two women are selling homemade sweets or whatever. Oh, this is a very one of these selling vegetables, but also very poor. So you can find this in the very center of Havana. The centrality has died and has been transferred to this suburban center, which is not a center. And this is part of the ruralization of Havana. The revolutionary government built more than 600 new rural towns throughout the countryside, hoping that this would keep people attached, peasants attached to the ground, to farming. They made a mistake. They made buildings 5-story high in the middle of nowhere, and people, after convincing a peasant to move into a 5th floor, and when he realized that he was in the middle of nowhere with all the disadvantages of living in a 5th floor walk-up, of course, no elevators, he moved to the nearest town. And this contributed to the lack of labor force, and one of the big problems we have right now is to raise the food to feed the population of Havana. And then we had these concrete buildings in the middle of a banana field, and on the other hand, they were building these very ugly, poor thatch roofs in the middle of Vedado, and bringing all the red, very rich red soil of the cropping fields south of Havana into the city, thatch roofs. This is all made with palm trees. And this is a mentality, and this is what I call the ruralization of the city. But together with these structures is a way of life coming, and people trying to raise animals. We have a neighbor 2 buildings away from us that has the full rooftop covered with fighting roosters. And it's terrible, the roosters, because another conventional wisdom that is not true is that roosters sing in the morning when the sun rises. No, they sing the whole night through. Like the guy who blows the horn of the train in Bill's house. I don't know what happens to people here. Engineers all the time are, and you hear that from kilometers away. Okay. More of this small, this is an empty space from demolition, and then this is what the government, municipal government, was able to do. This very, very poor store, of course, no refrigeration, well. And this is an example of how in Vedado, even with this aura of elegance, you could find poverty but hidden behind classicist facades. This is what we call Ciudadela, which is a central court, long and narrow, with rooms on each side, and then common collective toilets and showers at the end of it. What happened is that people started building their own bathrooms and kitchens at the expense of the central court, and the court was turned into a very small hall, a corridor, and these constructions, makeshift constructions, that are very much endangered when there is a hurricane. They also block the ventilation and the lighting to the rooms. And then a funny thing is one of these rooms, the family living in one of these rooms, have added 2 more floors. So now they have a triplex. And this is something that can show what is going to happen in Havana in a more common way. Right now, where housing, you can buy or sell housing. This is an area in Central Havana. You can see the conditions. You can see how corner stores were turned into these makeshift dwellings, using the very high ceilings to create an intermediate loft, sometimes even projecting that into the street. And this is the part of Havana where with the highest population density. There are people living sometimes sleeping by turns because they can't sleep all at the same time. That's one of the reasons for the success of Malecon. And these are also these violations for the urban codes, urban regulations that are producing this kind of people. Some very poor, some not that poor, some like this. What I call the Pour Nouveau Riche. And another convenience store, look at it's a catalog of barbaric things, especially this kind of alien creeping up from the floor, eating the corner. And this kind of, maybe this is an educated man, Solomonic columns. And of course, and this is a present trend, horrible. Well, here you have a detail. These balustres, which are like primitive Mycenaean Venuses with very wide hips and big breasts. There's somebody producing this by the thousands, flooding Havana with this kind of things. And this was built, of course, obscuring the original facade behind. Another thing happens in the rooftops. So there is another city in the rooftops of the existing city. And these constructions are generally shacks. Oh, this is the guy with the roosters. All these are roosters with a cage. He's very considerate with the animals. When there's a threat of a hurricane, I don't know what, probably he takes all of them down into his bedroom or something. And or some people with a little more money are using the roofs as an extension, as a terrace, or with a small inflated pool or whatever. But I remember a long time ago, a very old inspector in Havana told me that the largest shanty town in Havana was in the rooftops of central Havana. And then I always said, but These intermediate makeshift lofts are horrible. They are very dangerous because they can burn. They're made with wood. The steps are very uncomfortable. There's lack of ventilation. It's ugly, whatever. But if you do that properly, it's an intelligent way of using high ceilings. Then you end with a duplex. And if you do these shacks in the rooftops properly, you end with a penthouse. So it's a interesting. It gives you a lead into something that is not wrong by itself, but it's wrong because it's badly made. Well, this is it, Cuban flag, done by a very good friend of ours that from Venice who passed away last month. Thank you.